Welcome, everybody. It's my great, happy honor to welcome Conor Hanick, a founding member of AMOC and the pianist who will be featured in the 2022 June Festival in any number of concerts, and we'll have a chance to talk about that. The festival this year is the exact 75th anniversary of the very first festival in 1947, which took place not in Libby Bowl, but in one of the school auditoriums at Ojai, where we've occasionally returned for the talks in Ojai. And it was very important to me and to all of us for this anniversary year to really have kind of a huge burst of energy that went forward. And AMOC, which is this remarkable collective of young artists, instrumentalists, singers, composers, dancers, choreographers, collectively be the music director, because as you've heard possibly from a past talk from its founders, Matthew O'Coin and Zach Winokur, they created this company to work in a very collective manner and to work in an interdisciplinary manner, and we'll talk about that as well. One piece of housekeeping, we're still in the period of sales for series passes. In a few weeks' time, we'll go on public sale for single tickets. And if you haven't had a chance to buy or renew series passes for this year, now's the time to do it, because once if you have preferred seats, they will go on public sale once we go to single ticket sale. So we encourage you to act sooner than later. It's great to see everybody, and Conor, welcome. It's ironically, Conor and I at the moment are a few blocks away from each other, but we're in separate Zoom rooms. So Conor, welcome virtually to Ojai Talks.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to see some familiar faces, and not the least of which is yours, Ara. So nice to see you.
Conor is a pianist of amazingly wide-ranging repertoire. I've heard him play everything from Beethoven to Ligeti, in that case on the same program, alternating with each other in the most imaginative ways. He has performed with a number of major international festivals as a soloist and ensemble musician. He's performed with several major orchestras across this country. He is now on the chamber music and piano repertoire faculty of both the Juilliard School, of which he's an alum, as well as of Northwestern University. And Conor is director of piano for Music Academy of the West in Santa Barbara. So Conor, let's just begin a little by your own background. And although we've known each other for a good number of years now, I've never asked you, tell us about where you grew up and how music came into your life, and maybe that moment when you realized that music was going to be the focal activity of your life.
Yeah, I have a very unsexy origin story when it comes to music making. And it's humble, but in a certain way, that's the thing that I appreciate most about it, which is that I started playing the viola of all instruments as a string orchestra member of my community middle school, switched to violin, played orchestra for a number of years, actually, before I even started piano lessons, which I didn't begin formally until I was about 11 years old. And yeah, I grew up in Iowa City, Iowa, and they happen to have a really vibrant cultural scene because of the university, but also the orchestra at the the high school that I attended was sort of nationally known. A lot of really remarkable players came out of that program. There was also the Prussel School of Music, which was founded by Bill Prussel, the former concertmaster of the Cleveland Orchestra, his parents. And I actually studied with Doris Prussel at her school in Iowa City. So all to say, I was kind of involved with music from a young age, but it never kind of really grabbed me and took a hold of me and my sort of professional aspirations until I was in college. Really, I was a double degree major at Northwestern, had a lot of interests, and I think I kind of always knew that it was where I would end up, but as a formal decision where I said, okay, I need to really practice, I need to really create a network, I need to meet composers, I need to learn what I'm doing here. I that was a really late decision for me, in my early 20s. And it required me to take a year off after Northwestern and like really practice, which I used every hour of the day to, and I auditioned at Juilliard and stayed there through master's and doctorate.
What was I've got to ask, what was the double major? What was the other field?
Well, I started as a chemistry major, and got actually about into my second year and then was like, this is absolutely not for me. And then made a very poor lateral move into the engineering school, actually, which I quickly realized was also not for me. And then I went back into the arts and sciences school and ended up as an English major, as so many English majors, that path as well.
And I know you, as I mentioned, to have very wide-ranging repertoire. You defy categorization. You play really the gamut of piano music with a focus on more recent music. Has that always been the case?
Not really. I think especially early on, I was drawn to the music that a lot of kids are drawn to, and for good reason, kind of the warhorse repertoire, the romantic repertoire. And I was thinking about this today, thinking that maybe we would cover some version of this question, and I realized actually that coming to new music was actually like the thing that kept me in music. Not only because that was the thing that I became very, very interested in, but my experiences in new music were the things that allowed me to approach older repertoire in a way that I felt confident is the right word, but just like that I was spending my time well. And I think probably a lot of conservatory musicians deal with this sort of existential question of like, what are they bringing to repertoire? What do they have to say about it? And trying to answer those questions in a serious way. And I, for my undergrad especially, was kind of running into dead ends with the traditional repertoire, just because there's so many great performances, so many great pianists, so many really meaningful, profound things being said about that music. And it wasn't until I confronted a new score that had literally never been heard before that it clicked in my mind that, you can approach all repertoire this way. And in fact, that repertoire deserves to be approached that way, and not carry so much baggage with it. There are obviously historical things that one needs to bring to all interpretive activities, but to look at Beethoven and Passionata and say, okay, I'm going to play this piece as if it's never been heard before is a different thing than saying, okay, I'm going to play the 400,000th iteration of the Beethoven and Passionata. So that was a real light bulb for me, and I think it allowed me to now in my life approach that repertoire with a little bit just in a different way, and make me feel like I actually have something meaningful to say about it, both on its own terms, the music on its own terms, but also in a sort of personal way.
Were there turning point new pieces that what were the sort of the first loves as you began to explore newer repertoire that helped turn this, sort of flip this switch?
Yeah, I remember very well. It was at Northwestern, and at that time, Ursula Oppens was still teaching there. She's since moved to New York and is teaching at Brooklyn College there. But I had studied a few semesters of chamber music with her, and I heard a recital that she gave at Northwestern that included Shevsky's music, a composer, rest in peace, she's championed over the years all of the really major works of his, from The People United to the Four Pieces to Movements of Squares and the North American Ballads have all been dedicated to her, in addition to some more recent pieces. And it just was like an explosion of just the most remarkable sounds, both because they were novel to me, but also just the sheer command and imagination of Ursula, which she continues to exhibit today, is just so remarkable. And yeah, the next day I ordered the score. It was the Four Pieces for piano, not the North American Ballads, but an earlier set of pieces that were written for Ursula. And the score is completely indecipherable to me when I first looked at it, but it was a great lesson, something that Taka Kigawa, another amazing pianist in New York, and I talk about all the time, about how do you actually learn these scores. And you learn it like everything else. You start in measure one and you figure it out. And I figured that piece out, and I was able to play it for her. And that, it's like a gateway system into all these other genres and composers and styles that continues today, to be frank.
Just a note, if you didn't catch the name, the composer Conor is referring to is Frederick Shevsky, Rzewski, who sadly left us not very long ago, was an expatriate for most of his life, living in Belgium, but a uniquely American voice, a pretty fierce pianist himself. And if the music's not known to you, I think we would both highly commend that exploration. Soon after, you began working with composers directly, and I wanted to ask you about that process and what experiences directly with composers also sort of helped shape the focus of your work and had their own aha moments. It's one thing to play the Appassionata Sonata and bring your own insights and analysis and second guess Beethoven, but it's another to play a piece of Matthew Aucoin that's written for you and to ask Matt, do you want this or do you want that? So talk a little about formative experiences with composers directly.
Yeah, it's something that is always changing, and I've found possibly the hard way, there's no hard and fast rule of approaching composers in terms of what you're bringing to the collaboration and what they're bringing to the collaboration. But yeah, I started working with a lot of composers at Juilliard because when I got there, having kind of turned the page on all of these other interests and saying, okay, this is what I'm doing, I basically had like an open door policy, quite literally sometimes, when I would just be practicing and, if a composer at Juilliard hears you playing something written after Prokofiev, they are knocking on your door and saying, hey, do you want to play on my composer recital? Or, hey, there's a new Juilliard ensemble concert, do you want to play the piano for it? And I mean, this happened like the third day that I was at Juilliard. I was like thrilled about it. And when a group of composers catch wind that, oh, there's this pianist that it hasn't said no to anybody yet, they continue to, buy you drinks at Malachi's or whatever it was. And it turned out to be great. I mean, some of my best friends to this day are people that I met that first year at Juilliard, and some of the composers that I continue to work with are those musicians. And I don't know, to your question, I think, as I said, it kind of varies with composer to composer. I've worked with composers who almost treat their score as like an artifact, as if they weren't there. They created it, they've handed it over, and now it lives its life in the open, wild terrain of new music musicians. And they have a very sort of hands-off approach to it. And then other composers who have a very intense relationship with how their music is realized. And if you're lucky enough to work with them, that can be a really valuable experience. And then, you know, usually it's somewhere in the middle where you're given a score, you know, you bring what you can to it, you play for the composer, they offer you notes, and there's a sort of collaborative process. One thing about AMOC that I think is a very welcomed wrench in this equation is that often when we commission composers, it's not necessarily just for a score, it's we're commissioning kind of a collaborative process, so that when a composer is kind of added to the circle that we have, it's they give you a score, of course, but there's a lot of tinkering and tweaking and you know, musical collaboration that happens after the delivery of a score. And you know, of the projects that I've worked on with AMOC that are kind of in that ilk, I don't think any score that was delivered ends up the same after, you know, everybody has had their hands on it and their say with what goes into it. I mean, that goes for every element of a performance, musical and otherwise, with AMOC, but it's particularly interesting with the composers that we worked with.
Well, you've helped make the transition perfectly to talking about AMOC. AMOC, the acronym stands for American Modern Opera Company, but in this case, opera doesn't refer to La Boheme and Aida and Carmen. It refers to the origin of the word work, the Latin word for work. And so it's hardly an opera company, but a cross-disciplinary collaborative. What drew you into AMOC, and what does AMOC provide for you that some of your other activities as a solo pianist or teacher don't?
Yeah, being invited into the group was one of the happiest strokes of luck in a certain way that I've ever experienced. I was in Santa Barbara at Music Academy of the West, and Matt O'Coin was there guest conducting. And I'd obviously known of his work, and I think he had heard me play once or twice, and we just chatted a lot while he was there. And during one of those chats, it came up that the piano concerto that he had written through this Gilmore Festival commission, the pianist was backing away, and kind of like in the moment, he was like, "Hey, do you want to play this piece?" And of course, I said yes immediately, as I did like those first days in Juilliard. Just you say yes to things like this, and it turned out to be a tremendous experience. That whole other thing, but it gave us this opportunity to get to know each other in a really deep musical way. Me, his music, and him, my playing. And we just have a sort of artistic simpatico, I think. And him saying, "Hey, do you want to be a part of this other group of utterly mind-bogglingly original, brilliant thinkers and players and just capital A artists," was like truly the gift of my life so far. And you know, I'm very humbled to be a part of such company. You know, before I signed on to this, I was practicing Harawi, which is featuring prominently in the Ojai Festival, which Julia Bullock and I begin rehearsing in a few weeks. And I was just like, oh my God, I'm playing Harawi with Julia Bullock. It's still a kind of a little bit of a surreal fairy tale in my mind. So it's totally my pleasure, as it were.
Olivier Messiaen's Harawi is what Conor is referring to. It's a song cycle, early song cycle of Messiaen, kind of part of a family of pieces that includes the Turangalila Symphony. That will be the Saturday night concert at this year's Ojai Festival with Julia, but with, in true AMOC fashion, expanded and reflected upon with other elements. But maybe before we give those away, just introduce Harawi. What it's a epic piece of Messiaen's for soprano and piano. Tell us a little about it, just to tantalize us.
I mean, it truly is epic in all proportions. It's sort of, with a lot of his music, it's sort of not music for Earth, it's music for the cosmos and for the universe. And we're just lucky that we get to hear some version of it down on the planet here. But the Harawi itself, as you mentioned, is part of what he called the Tristan trilogy, which is sort of based on the lore of Tristan and Isolde, which of course is infamous through Wagner's opera, but it's basically achieving a sort of sublime love through death as the kind of only means of that realization. And so, as you can imagine, the poetry is fairly heavy, as is the musical content. Messiaen wrote all of the poetry himself in Wagnerian fashion. It's truly a sort of Gesamtkunstwerk in that way. And essentially, the first half of the cycle is about kind of earthly love, kind of reminiscence, the good times, the bad times, sort of thing. And then there's a very dramatic kind of demarcation in the middle where the lovers say goodbye to each other. And the second half of the cycle exists in the cosmos. The poetry is very symbolic and kind of amorphous and perfumed and surreal, and the music, it's some of my favorite Messiaen music, honestly. It's cosmic music. I mean, the figurations, the constructions, the sound worlds, the harmony is just unlike things that should exist on Earth. It's just truly a remarkable thing, and the piece is remarkable because it continues to ascend from there. I mean, it's Earth, it's heaven, and then it's something beyond that. Messiaen was not a modest composer in this way. All of his music sort of ends in that realm, and this piece is no different. And certainly one of his most successful, I think.
Well, you described it as music of the cosmos, which is also probably the perfect transition to talk about Hans Otte and the Book of Sounds. And let me just tell a personal tale of how this came about. I heard Conor in a house concert in Santa Barbara last summer, and there was the most mesmerizing, kind of bewitching piece by a composer I hadn't heard of. And it was my first experience. It was excerpts from this equally epic cycle, about an hour and 10 minutes, right, Conor? Right. By a German composer named Hans Otte. And one of the first things we discussed in planning this year's Ojai Festival was just the opportunity to hear this pretty astonishing piano piece. And so let's take a few minutes to set it up, and then we'll get a sneak preview of a video recording that Conor has made and hear the first movement of it. Hans Otte was born in 1926 and died in 2007. He was a kind of pan-artistic spirit. He was a pianist, composer, but also radio artist, visual artist, text artist. In European music circles, he was one of the great champions of John Cage, but also the early minimalists, Terry Riley and Lamont Young, and the early works of Steve Reich. And he wrote this piece called The Book of Sounds, which is in 12 movements, lasts about an hour and 10 minutes, in between 1979 and 1982. And he's about 10 or 12 years younger than Steve Reich, older, I should say, sorry, 10 or 12 years born before Steve Reich and Philip Glass. And hearing the piece was a revelation. Tell us how you came into this piece and how you were drawn in, and your experience of the piece.
Yeah, I was anticipating this question a little bit, Ara, you'll forgive me. And I was thinking, when was the first time I actually heard this piece? And it dawned on me that the first time I'd heard of it was not in a concert or a CD, but it was actually on Facebook. I know we're not allowed to say that anymore, and I have since deleted my account. However, I used to be on Facebook, and I followed an amazing pianist named Ian Pace, who plays some of the gnarliest, thorniest scores that exist. He has kind of a famous recording of Michael Finney's History of Photography and Sound, which is this 5-hour new maximalist piece that's extraordinary. And I'd sort of known him through that, and he's sort of a cantankerous personality on the internet. But he had listed something that was like, these are the to me the greatest works of the 20th century for piano. And Hans Otte's Book of Sounds was on there, which was one of a few that I had not heard of. And he made a little asterisk to it and said, not only is this, in my mind, one of the greatest works, but it is the most beautiful piece of music of the 20th century, like full stop. And I was like, okay, somebody like Ian Pace who says that, I mean, what is this thing? Like, how could that elicit something, a description like that? And so I got a recording. It was Otte's own performance of it, which is stunning, stunningly beautiful. There are a couple good recordings of it, his being one of them, and Herbert Henke's being the other really great one on ECM. But you know, you start with track one, and as you'll hear, it's in a way the simplest of musics, but it's also kind of the most profound and most beautiful, and it just grips you from the first 2-note little dyad, and the journey that then commences is just unlike anything in music. I believe that. I've played it a number of times now, and no matter how much I know the piece in terms of just like my physical command of it, or sort of like my musical idea about the piece, each performance is wildly different. And I'm most of the time just a complete mess by the end of it. You'll hear in the first movement, the sort of like rocking, oscillating motive, and the whole piece kind of has this symmetrical structure, and the final movement to me feels very much like kind of a berceuse in the same way. It has this rocking thing all on the white keys. And when you get there after the hour plus that came before it, it's just transformative, and it's a stunning achievement, I think.
The one area of Otto's interest I didn't mention was his deep involvement both with European and Eastern philosophy and meditation. So there is clearly a kind of spiritual dimension to this piece. Can you expand on that a little bit and your experience of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think when he was first playing it, there are descriptions of people approaching him after the performance and say things like, oh, this was a healing experience, or like I had like a sort of outer body feeling. And I don't know if this is something that he was, I think I know the answer to this, but if it's something that he was really consciously trying to cultivate, or if this is just the sort of effect of a work. But it very much is a part of his own philosophy, strands of Eastern philosophy, this sort of Cagean element of you know, quote unquote, freeing a sonority or a sound and kind of letting it behave and interact with its environment on its own terms. You know, it's no wonder that this was coming out of post-war music and all of the really hyper-controlled serialism and those sorts of styles. And it kind of, Otte's piece could kind of only exist in opposition to that music. I'm not sure it would exist if it weren't for, you know, the explosive stylistic change that happened after World War II. But it's taking all of those shackles and like the strictures of form and saying no to it, and letting the music do a completely different thing.
Two other elements of the piece, and then we'll hear the first movement as a preview. But I think the experience of the whole is very far removed from hearing any excerpt. One is what it does to one's sense of time. Even in my experience of hearing you play it, it's time either ceases to exist or expands in hearing this piece, and we've scheduled it. It's the Sunday morning concert at 10 a.m., which tends to be a bewitched time in Libby Bowl, surrounded by nature. So I think that the mesmerizing sort of timelessness of this piece will have its right setting. And the other is the title, right? The Book of Sounds. It's on one level, it's an exploration, the most caressing exploration of sound. And I was going to say, no recording and the video on Zoom quite captures the incredible sensuality of just kind of touching and contemplating the sound in person. Are those fair takes on elements of the piece?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the sense of time warp that you're describing, I think, is very much a part of it, and it kind of is part of a larger, if I could say, agenda of the piece, which is these, because it is very formalized in the end. It kind of has this effect of washing over you, but each movement is its own little piece of art, really. I mean, he worked 3 years on it, and there's not a single note or dynamic or gesture that is out of place. It's really exquisite in that way. But the piece is essentially built on dichotomies. It's about fast music, it's about slow music, and the relationship of moving between those two spaces. In a kind of geekier way, it's about major and minor, or a tonic and a subdominant, and things like these. But he's exploring those extremes. But what this piece is really about is the space between, and I think that's where the sort of Book of Sounds quality comes from. And it truly is a spectrum. It's a gradient. It's a 0 to 10 with every possible integer in between. I just wanted to mention one thing that I was thinking about right before this, at the risk of being slightly in the weeds, but to kind of prep the first movement, which has one of these dichotomies that I'm talking about, which is like a C major chord and an E minor chord. And the reason, you don't have to be a musician to get the sort of emotional principle at play here, which is that a C major chord can turn into an E minor chord by a single note moving the shortest possible distance from itself. And I think part of what this piece is trying to say or comment on or explore is the very emotional way that music can be. And the difference between a major chord, you know, in crude terms like the happy chord, and a minor chord, the sad chord, is literally a degree of the smallest increment on the piano. And when you combine these two things, you are left with something that is more beautiful than just a major chord, more beautiful than just a minor chord. And it's this sort of remarkable space in between that I think is how this piece casts its spell.
Conor recently made a video recording of the complete cycle for a very innovative New York-based series called Death of Classical, which was highly imaginative artistic director named Andrew Ousley, hearing all these pronouncements of classical music as dead, and then placing the most vibrant performances of music in crypts under churches and in cemeteries. And so the Death of Classical name of the series is quite tongue-in-cheek, but you'll see that the setting is in the Greenwood Cemetery in New York City, in a crypt, and filmed and recorded beautifully. The entire film will be released on later in the spring by Death of Classical and the All Arts channel, but we've been very lucky in that they've given us permission to do a kind of preview screening tonight. And so with that as introduction, we'll hear just the first movement of Hans Otte's Book of Sounds. And I would just say, just for the next 10 minutes or so, just switch off your internal clock, especially the second hand, and settle into the piece and let it work its beauties into you. So that's the first movement of Hans Otte's The Book of Sounds, and the almost physical space that each sound occupies becomes a part of the experience of the piece. As I said, hearing it, especially in Zoom quality sound, is a little like looking at a postcard of the Grand Canyon, but at least it gives you a hint of the Grand Canyon, and the in-person experience of the piece in real time is something quite special. We'll have time in a minute or two for any questions you may have of Conor about especially this piece. The one thing I wanted to say, and I think probably important to establish, Conor, when we just hear one movement out of the 12, there are very different lengths and very different characters. So don't assume you know what's at issue with this piece from the one movement. This is the beginning of a very long arc. Do you want to talk about sort of that journey, the shape of the piece and its varying moods?
Yeah, it covers a lot of ground. And there's a sort of, as I mentioned, a sort of beautiful symmetry that exists in it. It's not a perfect symmetry. It's not like a Bergian sort of, everything is a retrograde after a certain point or anything. But essentially, there's a feeling that the piece becomes more and more chromatic as it moves toward the center, and then the chromaticism dissipates as it moves toward the conclusion. And the very middle of the piece is the sixth movement, and as you can hear from the first movement alone, it's a very lush piece. It's very much about harmony and a sort of like a super major, almost like that sort of Ligeti term where you put two majors on top of each other and it's sort of like even more major. It's very much about that type of sonority. However, at the very middle of this piece in the sixth movement, it's just a page long. It lasts maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and it's a single line at the very upper octave of the piano. And it's, triple piano and a very slow tempo, and this single chromatic line just sort of snakes around a very limited register in, I think the dynamic ranges from 3 Ps to 1 P at its climax. And it's like he's saying that all this music that kind of encompasses this middle movement is stripped down to its most bare, most exposed, most kind of vulnerable form. And I find the moving to be totally bewitching. And you'd think that it would be kind of a drag to listen to, but it's remarkable how many permutations and characters and colors that he's able to achieve in a single octave that is kind of a colorless octave on the piano, honestly. And with, just these 12 pitches, it's remarkable. But then, the piece kind of comes back down to earth, or, in a sort of Messiaen way, continues to rise, as it were. And it kind of retrogrades itself and becomes more saturated in these very pastel harmonies.
And I don't, there's no way of tracking performances of it, so I can't claim that it's a Southern California or California premiere, but it's a piece that's quite rarely done. So this is really a special opportunity to hear it, and in the most subtle of and expressive of hands, and Conor Hanick, from my own experience of hearing Conor play it. We'll end on that note. Thanks, everybody. It's one of the difficulties of these lovely Zoom sessions is resisting the temptation to just say hello individually and express pleasure at seeing each of you in the individually, but know that the pleasure is felt by all of us. And if you're curious to explore Hans Otte, it's Sunday morning at the Ojai Festival on June 12th. And Conor did mention Otte himself made a recording of the piece, as well as a German pianist named Herbert Henk on the ECM label, if you would like to explore those. But as I said, ultimately, this is a piece best experienced whole in person. Thanks, everybody, and have a lovely evening. See you very soon.
Thank you all. Nice to see everybody.